Hello, welcome back. This is Restoration History, and we're doing a quick overview of church history. So today, we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. And so you might even look at that word, Protestant Reformation. In it, you can see the word protest, because that is what it was, a protest against especially the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, and the word reform, that is to reform or to change the church and the way the church was acting at the time. So this is where the name Protestant Reformation or the Reformation comes from. It didn't really start off as a kind of movement to start different churches. It was an idea that we should actually reform the church to make it more like you see in the New Testament, more like you see in the Bible, less corrupt. And of course, that's what we're gonna talk about today. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. There were many problems in the church. As I've already alluded to, there was a lot of corruption, a lot of problems in the church. Here you see a nice aerial view of St. Peter's Basilica and Vatican Square, something that perhaps you've seen in the news. But this would be the focal point, the Vatican. They're located in Rome, its own tiny principality, state there in Italy. And we see that the church has several problems. By the time we get to this, the power of the papacy has grown. The power of the church, it's the most powerful organization in Europe. There's no doubt about it. It's more powerful than any king. It's more powerful than any kingdom or country. It is the Roman Catholic Church. But there's a lot of corruption that's in there. What has brought about this corruption? Well, there's a lot of money involved. You know, whenever money is involved, it can lead to corruption. It can lead to people to do certain things to get that money. One of the things is that if you had a royal family or a noble family, let's say a duke, the duke has multiple sons. His oldest son would probably going to become the duke, so that's good. That's fitting for him. But what about his second son or his third son? What are they going to do? How are they going to live a life of which they are accustomed? Well, one of the ways it could come about is if one of them became a high member of the clergy, say a bishop, or maybe even an archbishop, a cardinal, a pope. Well, as you can see, if you're the duke of a certain area, you would want the bishop of that area to be friendly to you, that you two would get along. And what better way to do that than, say, have your son do it for you, all right? So absenteeism was really the idea that you might have more than one church office. In other words, you might be, say, the bishop of a smaller sort of population area, and also maybe simultaneously bishop of a large city, in a large city. Now, which one would you spend most of your time in? Well, you probably spend most of your time in the large city. More stuff to do there. That's probably the center of power. But why do you pick up this other bishopric or this other territory? It's just a way of adding money. But what that means is that you are absent. You are absent from that. You are absentee from one of those positions. If you have multiple positions, it's very difficult to have multiple positions and to give all of them your proper attention. So absenteeism then means that you would not be around to sort of look things over and view things, and this would lead to corruption. And of course, corruption often leads to it. Another of these is the practice of simony. Those of you who have studied the book of Acts might actually be familiar with someone named Simon. Now, I don't mean Simon Peter, but I mean Simon the sorcerer. Do you remember Simon the sorcerer, or sometimes called Simon the magician? Simon the magician, or the sorcerer, wants to buy, if you go back and read the story, he really wants to buy the office of apostle. He wants to have the same power as the apostles have because he thinks he can make a lot of money doing that. That's really the bottom line. And so he attempts to buy it. Attempts to buy it from Peter and John. And of course they say no. But this comes to be known as simony. Simony then is attempting to buy power within the church, buy a position or an office within the church, which you can then, of course, in his case, he wanted to turn it into more money for himself. Pluralism is basically having more than one church office. So pluralism leads to absenteeism. Simony means that you're buying the office. For example, let's say a bishopric comes up in a place like Germany, one of the areas, let's say Saxony, someplace like that. And you are the Duke of Saxony, and you would like your son to be the Bishop of Saxony. Well, the problem is, a lot of other people might want their sons to be the Bishop of Saxony. And so what do? In fact, the papacy, the church, offers up the office pretty much to the highest bidder. And so basically you have to pay a lot of money to the Pope, to the church, to get this position. In fact, usually you have to pay more than you even have. And so this means that you end up with having to pay not only when you're getting into the position, but you have to promise you'll pay after you're already assumed a position of being a bishop. That's going to come up here in a moment. All right, now, why is everybody so concerned about corruption in the church? One of the reasons was, you have to remember, they've gone through the Black Plague recently, and the plague lingered. It was multiple waves of many people dying. Many say maybe a half of all the people in Europe died during the Black Plague. Terrible death. And so for a lot of people, when there's bad times, a lot of people turn to religion. And if you're going to turn to religion because you're having a bad time, you don't want that religion to be corrupt. You don't want it to be phony. You want it to be real. And so many people had a desire for meaningful religion. Part of the problem is that their religion, that many of their church leaders were corrupt. And so they begin to look not elsewhere in other religions, but they begin to look at more mystical or sort of personal rather than through the sort of corporate means of the church. Well, part of what happens there then is that we see the rise of relics. Relics are things that can connect you with your faith. They can connect you with Christ, or they can connect you to a martyr, a bone of a martyr. And in this case, take a look here, this picture, a piece of the true cross in this crystal tube is a small piece of wood said to come from the cross upon which Jesus was crucified, the piece of the true cross. Now, there were a lot of these going around, right? So somebody wrote that if you took all the pieces of the true cross, you could build Noah's Ark. That's how many there were, because people in the Middle East would sell. People wanted it, so they sort of manufactured these things, and of course people took them back home, and they become something then that some very wealthy people would collect, others would take to their local church, and people would come visit it and be inspired by it. Well, Frederick the Wise was one of these kind of people. He was a prince, basically. He was a German ruler. And Frederick the Wise of Saxony had over 5,000 different relics by 1509. Many of these came back with the Crusades and circulated in Europe. Well, he had this own personal collection. Now, part of what this does too is that a relic can sort of make money for your area, make money for your congregation. because tourism, tourism today, we know tourism they had sort of back then. People would make a pilgrimage, say to a particular town or church or cathedral, to see one of these items. And while they were doing that, of course, they would need to eat. They would probably need a place to stay. They would have other expenses. They would want to buy souvenirs. And, of course, you would ask them to make a nice donation to your congregation, right? To help pay for the building, to help pay for the upkeep of all of this. So it's popular with people, very popular. They wanted to go, but it's also quite profitable for many. Now, another thing we need to mention that becomes important and is also profitable are indulgences. Indulgences. Indulgence turns out to be a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper, it's a document which is produced by the church. And this document will really state on it, what you could do is you could pay for this document to be produced. They would be all written out pretty much, and then someone would be seated there and you would tell them the name of your relative. Let's say it's your granny. Let's say it's your grandmother. You loved your grandmother loved you. She made you nice cookies. She was always nice to you. But you knew that Granny sometimes did things she shouldn't do. And now she's died. And the Roman Catholic theology had down that unless you pretty much were a saint, I mean a real saint, you've done just so many great things, you were going to go to heaven eventually, if you were a Christian, but not directly. You were going to go to a place called purgatory. And purgatory was a place where you were going to make up for the bad stuff that you hadn't repented, make up for the bad stuff that you'd done over and over again through a kind of punishment that you would have there in purgatory. Now, what an indulgence allowed you to do was to make sure that your granny was not going to go to purgatory, is not going to stay in purgatory. You could go and buy this indulgence, pay for this indulgence. They would write your grandmother's name down on it, and then they would take, of course, money from you. They would hand you that document, and then you would know that your grandmother was no longer in purgatory. Okay? For every coin in the coffer that rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Well, that was one of the sales pitches that they had anyway. So it's purgatory and profit. So you see there's money getting involved with the relics, money getting involved with indulgences. All this is going to come to play with a young, eventually monk by the name of Martin Luther. And here we see a young Martin Luther. You don't usually see him this way. And you see him in the dress of a monk. And notice his hairstyle here. This is a tonsure, which is basically where you would cut off all the hair, on the top of your head, and then you would let it grow around. Now, this would mark you as a monk. And not only that, but the way the clothes that you would wear would mark you as a monk as well. Well, this is a very young Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born in 1483. He will die in 1546. Now, Martin Luther's father was very powerful influence on him, and I suppose that sort of goes without saying. Our parents are powerful influences on us. Your father, whether he is present or absent, is still a powerful influence. If your father is absent, that's also an influence on your life. But Martin Luther's father was definitely there. Martin Luther really had high hopes for his son. Martin Luther's father had high hopes for Martin, that he would become a lawyer, that he would not have to do what his father had done. His father had worked in the mines, but he had done quite well. And in fact, he had become a kind of a manager of mines and had made some money. So he wanted his son to go off and study at the university and become a lawyer, right? Perhaps your parents have aspirations for you and maybe you don't share them. Martin was a bit reluctant. I don't think he was that excited about becoming a lawyer, but he was dutiful, so he went off and he studied at the beautiful U of Erfurt. Good old U of E, U of Erfurt. And here he began his studies, and he began to study to be a lawyer. Well, in 1505, you see, 1505, he's coming home. Maybe it's for Thanksgiving break. Maybe it's spring break. At any rate, he's going home, and he has to go by foot, because most people had to walk at this time. Of course, they had no vehicles, and he was a poor college student. He was walking there. He had to walk through the woods, which was very dangerous and kind of scary anyway, because there were bandits, there were robbers, there could be wild animals. And of course, what happens to him is that a great storm comes, a terrible storm, with lightning and thunder and rain pelting down on him, and the wind is blowing. And in fact, the wind blows over a tree, and it almost kills Martin Luther. Martin Luther thinks he's going to die. So what does Martin do? He makes a deal with God. Have you ever made a deal with God? Maybe you have. Maybe you say, Lord, if I could just pass this class, pass this test, next time I will study, next time I'll work hard. Lord, if no one finds out about this, I'll never do it again, Lord. I'll do whatever you want if you just help me out of this jam that I'm in. Well, Martin Luther made that kind of deal with God. Now, here's maybe the difference. Martin Luther kept his word. He vowed he would become a monk if he was spared. He was spared, so true to his word, he became a monk. Okay. Now, if Martin Luther could have found salvation through being a monk, it would have been Martin Luther, because he was very fastidious, very particular in what he did. He was very, very concerned about sin in his life. So much so that the abbot, that's the leader of the monastery, abbot from like the word Abba, father, the father of the monastery, sees how concerned Martin is, even sends him on a journey to Rome thinking, okay, this will help him out. But he comes back more disillusioned because he sees the corruption there. And finally, the abbot says, Martin, you seem to be a guy who's very concerned with things. You seem to be a smart fellow. We're going to send you off to the University of Wittenberg to get your doctorate. That's what we'll do. That's what we'll do with you. You're an intelligent guy. Let's send you there. So they did. And he goes off to the University of Wittenberg. By 1512, he's earned his doctorate. And they hire him, they put him to work immediately. Remember, he's a monk, so they don't really have to pay him much. They put him to work immediately, teaching theology at good old U of W, good old Wittenberg. And, he begins to teach. Now, when you begin to teach, sometimes things happen. Administrators have needs of courses being taught. And maybe you are assigned courses that you would think, man, this is not the course that I would seek out, but this is the course that I have. This sort of happens to Martin Luther. One of the things, of course, as we've said, he really doubted his salvation because he was holding to the Roman Catholic view of works salvation. It's really sort of work plus God's grace. God's going to give you grace, but you got to really do the work in order to deserve the grace. And Martin Luther said, I'm just not worthy enough. I sin far too much, and he doubts his salvation. And one of the things that he is assigned is the book of Romans to teach, the book of Romans, to the students there at the University of Wittenberg. So Martin Luther said, I'm not good enough. I doubt my salvation. I remember I had a professor years ago by the name of Jack Cottrell. He wrote a little book called Being Good Enough Isn't Good Enough. I always kind of like that title. Being good enough isn't good enough. And it's true. We can never be good enough if we're trying to earn our salvation. Anyway, he's assigned to the book of Romans. He goes through it. Of course, he'd read the book of Romans before. But if you really want to learn something, be assigned to teach it. Then you're going to look at it in a whole new way. And when Martin Luther is going through the book of Romans, he begins to see what Paul says there, and it begins to change his view. When Paul begins the book of Romans, go back and review it. What does Paul end up saying there in the first chapter or so? He will say, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Martin says, preach it, Paul. Yes, we've all fallen short. None is righteous, no, not one, Paul says. And again, Martin agrees wholeheartedly. And then Paul says this: we've sinned, and the wages of sin is death, eternal death. This is just reinforcing what much, yes, this is why I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough, Paul. Hit it home. But as Paul goes on, he begins to talk about how we don't have to earn our salvation. In fact, our salvation comes by grace. By grace are you saved, not works. As the King James says, lest any man boast. We are not saved by what we do, but by what Jesus did. And we hold to what he did. We believe in him. And then we have our salvation that comes to us. That's justification by faith. And that just revolutionizes Martin Luther. They used to have these cartoons in a newspaper, if you know what a newspaper is. It's a paper that would be delivered to your house with news in it, but they used to have the Sunday comics in there. Anyway, sometimes those comics would be shown with a guy with a little light bulb over his head. That means he got an idea, a bright idea. Martin Luther had a light bulb over his head. And he said, man, justification by faith, that's where it is. Justification by faith. The Roman Catholic idea was we put our faith with works. If you didn't have enough works, you probably didn't have enough faith. But Martin is going to see that what Paul is teaching is just faith. And so he begins to teach that all we need is faith in Christ and receive God's grace. Okay, so that's where he's at. All right. Now, right about this time, a guy shows up. And his name is Johann, or John, Tetzel. And he shows up in Wittenberg after Martin has had this kind of epiphany. He comes to Germany in 1517. And why is he there? He's there to sell indulgences. He's bringing the indulgences to you. He'd set up a table. He'd go to the square. He even put on little sort of plays and performance about the fires of purgatory and how you could save your loved ones. And he'd say, do you want your grandmother to suffer in purgatory? You can release her today. Come and pay the fee. Get this indulgence. Release this. Normally you bought them for somebody else. Maybe a child, maybe a parent, a grandparent, something like that, a brother, a sister. These selling indulgences, and when Martin Luther sees this, it just really, really gets to him. There are a lot of things that he had been reading and seeing and hearing about, and now it comes right to his town. And this really gets him upset. He says, I can't believe he's doing this. The Pope must not know what's going on. I'm going to have to bring these things to the attention of the Pope. And so he writes down what are called his 95 Theses. The 95 Theses of Martin Luther. And he nails them to the door of the church at Wittenberg. Now you might think, well, that's pretty crazy. He's going to get in trouble, right? Vandalism of the church. No. This was a common thing. The church was in the center of town. People would walk by as they went their shopping and went from place to place, and they would post announcements and other sorts of things like we might do, posting a flyer to let somebody know what's going on. And so if you imagine, let's say, one of the professors at the college writing down 95 things that professor once changed at the college, and then posting them. Of course, we probably wouldn't post them on the door of the school. We might put them in a blog, might put them as what they used to call tweets. What do you call now that Twitter is X? We used to call them tweets. Are they X's? I don't know. Anyway, he would post it publicly, and everyone would see it. As you might imagine, that professor might get a message to come talk to some administrator in their office. Well, Martin Luther did this on Halloween, right? October 31st, 1517, the eve before All Saints' Day. That's how it gets the name Hallow Eve, the Holy Eve before the Holy All Saints' Day, which of course had been a pagan holiday, and they had tried to Christianize it by making All Saints' Day the next day. Well, at any rate, he posts it up there, and this is going to get some attention. It's going to get some negative attention. He puts it on the door of the Castle Church right in the center of town. And when word of this gets out, Martin Luther thought that when word of this got out, the Pope would hear it, would thank him. Thank you, Martin, for bringing this to my attention. Yes, we're going to correct this. But no, the Pope knew all about this. This is what Martin didn't know. The Pope knew all about this. Pope Leo X was not uninformed. He was not uninformed. Martin Luther thought he was. He knew all about it. And in fact, he did not appreciate some punk monk, how's that, a punk monk, posting this stuff, criticizing the church. Who does he think he is? There in that backwater of Germany, backwater of Wittenberg, little town. You know, I'm the Pope, I'm in Rome. And so Martin thought, well, innocently, I suppose, that the Pope would appreciate it. But no, the Pope did not approve. And soon the Pope will kick Luther out of the church. He will excommunicate him. Now, Luther would have gone the way of John Huss, or Jan Hus, if you can look him up if you want. We don't have time to talk about it, but he was a guy who said a lot of things were wrong with the church, and he went to a big meeting, and when he got to the meeting, guess what? He found out he was on trial, he got convicted, and he was burned at the stake. This is probably what would have happened to Martin Luther, except that the Duke of Saxony protected Luther. Frederick the Wise, yeah, the same guy that had all of those relics. He liked Luther, and he thought Luther had something there to say. And so we're going to see that Frederick the Wise of Saxony is going to make sure that when Luther gets called to answer for this, it's going to be in Germany, and it's going to be at a town called, not Worms, but they would call it Worms. Not the diet of worms. By the way, I'll sell you a book I've got about the diet of worms. Guaranteed you'll lose weight. High protein, low fat, low sugar. It's going to be great. You can just eat all the worms you want. Eat them any way. You can fry them. You can boil them. You can mix them up and eat them any way you want, and you'll definitely lose weight. But no, this is the Diet of Worms. Diet means a meeting in the city of Worms. You can look it up. There's a city in Germany along the Rhine. It's called Worms. Well, they have the big meeting there. In 1521, he's called to it. This is mainly because the German princes, primarily Frederick the Wise, is protecting Luther. He said, if you want to meet with Luther, you're going to come here to Germany and do it. He's not going to go down to Italy and do it. Because you know what? If he goes down to Italy and do it, we know he's never coming back. So he goes there. And he stands. Here he is. Here he is. He's standing in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's also standing in front of the papal legate. That's not the Pope, but that was a cardinal sent by the Pope. And then it has a lot of German princes here. And what they did is they took Luther's writings, and they stacked them up on a table here. And they told him, you must recant. You must take back everything that you wrote. If you take back everything you wrote, then, you know, we will sort of un-excommunicate you, or we will communicate you, I guess. And he is ordered to do that. And so it's recorded famously, and this is one of the most famous occasions in Martin Luther's life, and why he's a hero to many people. He stood up in front of all these powerful people. He put his hand on the writings that he's there. And he said, I stand. I cannot. I will not recant. So help me God. He said, if you can show me from Scripture that what I was written is wrong, then I will change it. But otherwise, here I stand. I cannot, I will not recant. And this would have probably been the end of Martin Luther, but, you know, they released him. And actually what happens to him is that Frederick the Wise sent guys with masks on. They kidnap Martin Luther on his way from this meeting, and they take him to a castle. Martin Luther doesn't know what's going on, but they hold him there in a castle under what we might call protective custody. and then it's revealed to him that really it was Frederick the Wise doing this. And while he's locked up for months, he actually translates the Bible into German, which of course was prohibited by the church, both the Old and the New Testament. He asks for books and he begins to translate. So this is how Martin Luther spends his time. Well, here's something that we talked about before, just a little review. Martin Luther's theology is going to turn out to be different than the Roman Catholic one. Of course, he doesn't like the corruption, but he also goes after the sacraments. Remember, we said sacraments are things that bring you grace. The Roman Catholic Church had 7, and we talked about this before, so I won't go over it in great detail here. But these 5 things Martin Luther will reject, and these 2 he will keep. So in other words, when you're born, you are christened or you receive your baptism. Then as you come to be, say, 12 or 13, you have your confirmation. Then you receive your first communion or your first Lord's Supper, which you're supposed to do every week. You're supposed to confess and receive the Eucharist every week. And then as you grow into adolescence, early adulthood, you have to choose. Are you going to get married to another good Catholic and have good Catholic babies? Or are you going to get married, so to speak, to the church and be in a holy order? And then as you approach the end of your life, a priest will come and put oil on your forehead in a sign of a cross and take sort of your last confession, if you can say it or not, and absolve you of your sins so that you will enter into heaven. Well, Martin Luther rejected those 5, but he kept those 2, and that becomes controversial because he is saying that the Lord's Supper and baptism actually brings God's grace. This did not go along well with not only with the Roman Catholic Church, but with many other Protestants. What are some of his other differences from the Roman Catholic Church? The Roman Catholic Church said that you would take the Bible, yes, but also all the tradition of the churches, the church councils, the church decrees, the papal pronouncements. Martin Luther said, no, I'm going to go for the Bible only, or he would put it this way, sola scriptura. The Roman Catholic Church says that the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion, is where the elements are transformed by the praying of the priest into the body and the blood of Christ, and then you partake of that. You're partaking of the body of Christ in its essence. That's called transubstantiation. Trans, like it's transformed in its substance into the body and blood of Christ. Luther said that the substance of Christ's body and blood is there somehow with the communion, but it's not transformed into it. This is called consubstantiation, because Luther will famously say, Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood," and he held to that very firmly. Now, also when it comes to the church and state, there were many German princes who will convert to Luther's way of thinking and what's now going to be called the Lutheran Church. We would like to say all of them did it for theological reasons, but some of them were also motivated for political reasons, because they could get independent of the Holy Roman Emperor, independent of Rome, and having that money go down to Italy. That's good German money. But at any rate, across Germany, there are many areas that convert to Lutheranism. And Luther taught that the princes really had the authority from God, and that their authority, they should help the church. They should kind of oversee the church in many ways, or be a protector of the church. And so, of course, those princes kind of like that idea too, that the princes had the temporal realm, but that the church, of course, would have spiritual realm, but they need that temporal authority as well. Now, here's another important leader, because we have to move on, and we want to talk about this guy. His name is Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli, 1584 or 1484 to 1531. He is contemporary of Martin Luther, but he lives in Switzerland, what we would call Switzerland today. He studies at the University of Basel and the University of Zurich, and he is influenced by Christian humanists, as Martin Luther is. Christian humanists would teach that you should use your mind to understand the Bible and understand what God wants. And not just wholeheartedly accept what the church tells you, but you should use your mind and think about it. Read and study even Greek and Hebrew, if possible, to understand the Bible better. When Zwingli hears what Luther is up to, he likes what he's hearing. He supports Luther's ideas and this idea of justification by faith. Zwingli says, yes, that's correct. You got that right, Martin. And he works then with the Zwingli in Zurich, remember that, both Z's. He works with them through the city council to reform the church. And what they wanted to create was a theocracy where God was in charge of that city through the city council. So there really wasn't much difference between the church council and the city council. And so the people would live in Zurich were expected to go to church. They were expected to follow the rules of the church and keep this theocracy. So the state was ruled by the church. They were kind of merged together. Well, eventually, Zwingli and Luther will meet, because Zwingli will say, well, I like what Luther says, and Luther says, well, yeah, we should get together if we can. And they have this meeting here. It's called the Marburg Colloquy in 1529. And here, Luther and Zwingli will debate all the points, and they basically agree about everything except this idea of baptism and the Lord's Supper being efficacious. Zwingli said, no, these things are just symbols. Baptism is a symbol. Nothing happens there with your salvation. You don't receive grace there. Same with the Lord's Supper. It's just a symbol. And Luther said, no, these are sacraments. These give us God's grace. So Luther and Zwingli discussed merging, but by the end of this colloquy or meeting in Marburg, the city of Marburg in 1529, they cannot agree on this point and they separate their ways. And therefore the Lutherans and the Zwingli followers, or the Reformed movement of Switzerland, never merge. Now, probably the most famous Reformed leader eventually in Switzerland is a guy named John Calvin. You see him here. And I know some of you hipster kind of guys are really digging, as the kids say, that goatee. I always make this deal with my students. If by the end of this course you can grow a goatee that's of the same length and quality as John Calvin, I will give you extra credit. I will give you extra credit. And you also have to go get this hat. Get rid of the baseball cap and get yourself a proper hat. You know, there's a lot of other hats in the world besides a baseball cap. Well, anyway, John Calvin studies law at Paris. He was going to be a lawyer, but he was very interested in theology, and all these things were happening with Luther. He's a little younger than Luther, as you can see. He's probably about 20, almost 30 years younger. He reads Luther's writings. Of course, Luther's controversial, but he likes them. And he decides he's going to become a Protestant. He had been a Roman Catholic, but Luther's writings convinced him. And so once they figure this out at the good old University of Paris, they kick him out. They said, you can't be here. This is for Roman Catholics. You say you're not a Roman Catholic, you got to get out. And so he leaves. And where does he go? He goes to Basel, Switzerland. Now you may not know this, but in Switzerland, about half of the country speaks German, kind of on the German side, and the other half speaks French. So he goes to the French side of Switzerland. He feels pretty at home there, and they accept Protestant ideas, Luther's ideas, and here he begins to write his famous work, his most famous work, his magnum opus, The Institutes of Christian Religion, 1536. By the way, he will revise this, and he will keep working on this for the rest of his life, really. And this is what we might call the first systematic theology of the Protestant movement. So, we see that he settles in Geneva. Remember, Zurich is Zwingli, Geneva is John Calvin. The city council asked him to come here and to lead the Reformation, the change there, and they're going to use his writings as their guide. Now, that's not the only thing he wrote. He didn't just write the Institutes. He will write commentaries as well. But his institutes are the most famous. And they want to create Geneva into a city of saints. Now, because of his teachings, John Calvin, we're going to go over it. We've got a couple slides left, maybe one more. It's going to say that basically, how do you know? He's going to say that you're going to have to be among the elect. God's going to have to choose you ahead. Not based upon what you do, but God just chooses you. Or he doesn't choose you. How do you know if God chose you? Well, one of the ways you'll know is if you prosper. If you're prospering, if your life's going well, then you're obviously God's child. If things aren't going well, you're not among God's elect. Maybe you're not one of God's children. So that's part of what it is. So what are Calvin's teaching? By the way, here at Geneva, when they have this city council doing this is also the city of saints. They required people to go to church. They required people to follow the church rules. If you didn't do that, they would call you in criminal court, and you would be fined. You might be flogged. You might be put out in a public square in the stocks with your crimes above you, and everyone would go by, maybe spit on you, yell at you, that sort of thing. This kind of idea is what came to the America in the colonies early on in New England with many of the ideas there. Those people were strong Calvinists that came. Well, anyway, what are Calvin's teachings? I put up here Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Now, I'm sure none of you remember a guy by the name of Tiny Tim, but you can look him up. Tiny Tim. Now here, I'm not talking about the character from the Dickens novel. I'm talking about a kind of a strange guy that would sing, and he would play a little ukulele, and he got married on television to a woman, anyway, and he had a little song called Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which he sang in falsetto. I won't do that. I'll spare you that here. But you can look up Tiny Tim, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, and that's what this reminds me of. Because what happens here is that Calvin's teachings come under the acrostic of TULIP. That is the first letter, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and preservation of the saints. This spells out tulips, right? Or tulip. And so we're going to tiptoe through the tulip. Now what John Calvin will say is that you do not have the ability to believe in God because your mind is corrupt. You are fallen. You're so far fallen that even your mind doesn't work right. You can read the Bible, you can memorize it, but you won't understand it. You can hear 1,000 sermons and go to 1,000 conferences, and you're never going to get salvation through understanding. You're just not going to understand it because your mind is totally depraved. And because of that, God has to enlighten you through unconditional election. He will then choose you. He chooses some and he doesn't choose others. People on the left side of the room, he doesn't choose them. People on the right side of the room, he does. You don't like it, take it up with God. But that's God's choice. And it's not based upon you at all. It's just based upon God. He chooses some, he doesn't choose others. And if you don't like it, you say, well, God doesn't have to choose anybody. That's his mercy that he chooses anybody. So he unconditionally elects you, makes you a part of the elect, or grants you salvation unconditionally, not based upon anything that you have done. No works, no thoughts, no beliefs. He just chooses some. Then you don't believe. So God has to irresistibly draw you or give you grace. He sort of zaps your mind so that suddenly you understand you are among the elect, you see? And that's the irresistible grace. Now, once you have been saved, or let's put it this way, once you have realized you're among the elect, you're never going to not be among the elect. So as some people put it, once saved, always saved. Once saved, always saved. This is called the preservation of the saints. You're never going to fall away. That's an impossible concept because you're either among the elect or you're not among the elect. Okay? And so if you're among the elect, then you're going to be saved. Now, that leads to the most controversial of the letters, and that's the L, limited atonement. Would Jesus go to the cross and die for people who will never have salvation? We say that Jesus died on the cross for all, that his sins takes away all. But, God didn't choose everybody. So, according to Calvin's logic, and I suppose it makes sense if you accept his logic and his premise, they're not going to waste the grace or the work of Christ. And so this leads then to the idea that atonement is limited to only the elect. Now, the key to all of this is that God is completely in charge. You don't have any part in it. God's in charge. What he says goes. Man's depravity means we can't even understand it. So Calvinists might talk about free will, but it's probably going to be something very different than what you think free will is. You might think free will is you've just got a choice to do what you want. That's not what a Calvinist would really believe. You don't have that kind of free will to just choose Christ. You hear a message, oh, you've been reading the Bible. Okay, that starts to make sense. I'm going to go and I'm going to choose to follow Jesus. No, Jesus chooses you. There's an old hymn called Pass Me Not Thou Gentle Savior. You probably never heard that hymn. But if you go and look it up, Pass Me Not Thou Gentle Savior, it's basically saying, don't pass me by, Jesus. I know who you are. I believe who you are. And I want to have salvation. But I don't know if I'm among the elect, so don't pass me by today. Let me know that I am a part of the elect. Well, there's a lot more to be said here about this, but in the Restoration movement, we're going to see that these leaders reject, one of the things they have in common is that they reject Calvinism and this teaching that people do not have free will. And we'll say more about that later. Again, if you have any questions, contact me, and I'll be happy to try to answer them. Have a great day.